just now, we started off going back to core theories, core bodies of knowledge that could explain some of the things that we are trying to work with. And I must say this was informed also by the fact that we are practitioners ourselves. We often work with teams that are stuck. I tend to only get involved when the wheels come off. So I don't work with all that many successful projects. I very often work with the ones that are stuck. But I arrive there. Okay, So 3 bodies of knowledge. We started off with more, but we settled on these 3. One is around evolutionary economics, or some people call it complexity economics. It's not all that new. It's been around for quite a while, but people are now coming to grips with some of the consequences, and that's the interesting thing. People are starting to process it a little bit more. New institutional economics, which is also not all that new, which has also been around for quite a while, but focus quite a bit on how economies change over time. And then the third body of knowledge that is around complexity thinking and social change. And this is essentially about how people make a decision when you face alternatives, when you face opposition, or when you're simply paralyzed or confused. So that's the 3 bodies of knowledge that we looked at. I'm glad that Marcus wrote up some of the difficult parts of complexity. We'll explain that to you just now. So on evolutionary economics. So we share some similar reading material, and we were influenced heavily by the work of Eric Beinucker and Richard Nelson, two prolific authors. So we want to start off with explaining the evolutionary algorithm. This is something that is happening throughout nature. It's happening wherever humans and other creatures are involved. And it's that evolution is a learning algorithm. It is a process of figuring out what is possible within a given set of constraints. So there's a little algorithm that is around creating variety, which is not as easy as it sounds. From this variety, figuring out which ones to try, maybe in some other combination, and then the successful designs, the things that fit in a particular context, get taken up and gets amplified, which is then not to be confused with scale. The interesting thing with this evolutionary algorithm, if you look at it, is it reveals good tricks for survival. But this is possible looking backwards. It's very hard looking forward to say which tricks will survive. But you can, looking back, you can say, yes, appointing that person was the right decision, and you forget about the stress that you went through during that process. The thing here with markets is that markets incentivize this process at all the steps. Markets incentivize the creation of variety. Markets select between alternatives, and it then amplifies the successful designs by allocating resources. So markets play these different roles. And here markets shouldn't just be seen as marketplaces. It could be markets for ideas, for instance, within your organization or within a team. It follows a very similar logic.
Maybe just to, if you go one back, this point about universal phenomenon was for me really interesting to say. This is not just, we're not just drawing an analogy from biology and say, look, it looks very similar. No, it's actually saying, like, in the economy, this same thing happens. So if you abstract evolution into this algorithm, you can apply it in different places. It's not just we say, look, this is like businesses behave like ants, or businesses behave like genes, or whatever. But it's actually just the same algorithm works within an economy, that works within the biology, that works within other spheres, most probably. Okay.
So to again continue with some of the logic of Eric Beinucker and Richard Nelson, in evolutionary economics we make a distinction between 3 domains, 3 technologies, if you will, that must co-evolve. So the first one is around physical technologies. This is artifacts, which means stuff, things. Knowing what to do with it, knowing how to adapt and change and maintain them. So that's physical technologies, and the knowledge that goes with how to use it, how to maintain and adapt it. And this is actually, of the 3 areas, this is the easiest one because we can often see it all around us. Social technologies is slightly harder because these are ways, methods, means of organizing. It's formal and it's informal. It's about getting people to work towards common goals. So it's management techniques. It's how families relate. It's about how people that don't agree can in the end still cooperate. So those are all examples of social technologies that we find out there. And then a third area, in terms of evolutionary economics, this is also the more recent thinking, is around the capacity of people. You could call them entrepreneurs or you could call them managers, but it's people that are able to combine physical technology and social technologies to create organizations, to do things that are viable within a particular economic context. And these three things evolve. And if you now think back to the previous slide, it evolves through a process of creating variety, combining these in interesting ways, out of those, trying those, and then keeping what works. So this is a process that repeats over and over in economies. And some places, in some contexts, are more successful at doing that. And that's what we want to understand as development practitioners. Why do some places just tend to get this right easier, using less energy, maybe fighting less? So these three spaces are interdependent. And just to say here, physical technologies change very fast. And there's a lot of hype around how fast physical technologies are changing. Smartphones and even bots now answering your questions when you order stuff online and so on. Social technologies change very slowly. And it's much harder to keep track of the stock of social technologies that we have available in our society. So that's just when the physical technologies often evolve much more visible. So on all these levels, there's an important role for competition. And it's not competition now just as market competition. It's the ability of people to disagree and then to maybe even select something that seems to be more viable. The ability to at the level of individuals and within their networks to have these competing ideas and choosing between them, somehow choosing between 20 holiday destinations to, selecting two. It's within organizations and between organizations, the ability to generate this variety, to select out of this variety some things to try, and then to allocate resources to what seems to work, and then within societies. So, and these three layers are all present in an economy at the same time. It's individuals, it's organizations, a whole range of organizations, and then a whole range of markets, which could be, political scientists would even call it ideological markets, markets for ideas, markets for policies. And so what we find very often in developing countries is that we sometimes try to fix markets, but the ability of people to create a variation of ideas, diversity of ideas, and to play with these, even mentally, doesn't exist. Or it's not allowed. Maybe that is a better way of saying it. It's not encouraged in particular contexts. Okay, so that is a summary of a huge amount of reading, which I would definitely recommend you all also try. I don't think I've ever done that in 5 slides, but okay. So New Institutional Economics, which is a body of knowledge where there's far more written about. There's far more journal articles and publications on this. There's actually quite a lot of really famous people that are new institutional economists, but that don't say that anyway. So you've possibly come across this already a few times. So Marcus, this one's yours.
Yes, I think the important thing here is to understand what do we mean with institutions, or what do new institutional economists mean with institutions, because in our colloquial language, institutions often means something similar to organizations, or means organizations, or maybe public organizations or bigger organizations, like DFID can be an institution. Now, in new institutions, organizations are new institutional economics. These are seen as or defined as organizations, not institutions. Organizations are constituted by a fixed set of rules. They are usually hierarchies where you have a top-down command and control structure in place. They have an identity. They are PwC, or they're Mercy Corps. They're they have a brand usually, they have a strategy and intent, whereas institutions are more elusive, if you want. They're structures to organize social collaboration, interaction. They emerge out of the conventions emerge out of interacting with each other and optimizing and making this interaction more predictable. So they're far less tangible, I feel. And I think it's just important to keep these apart. So when we talk now in the realm of new institutional economics about institutions, it's these social constructs that we mean, and not the institutions as organizations, although they might overlap actually. Some organizations can take up roles that are institutional.
Is that clear? So, I think you've now explained almost all of these. Okay, so institutions in new institutional economics is about the rules of the game. It's that often unsaid understanding of how things are done, what is acceptable within the way we are talking to each other or behaving or doing things. And these institutions play a critical role. They reduce huge amounts of uncertainty. It often makes it even frictionless for people to engage with each other around all kinds of topics. And it creates an incentive structure. I think we'll say something about that a little bit later. But it really, I think it aligns also with what you said. I mean, this shapes to a certain degree payoffs, payouts. You know, what is acceptable to take as a reward for your good efforts. These are all kinds of things that are determined by incentive structure, institutions. And the important thing here is that economic performance, without us going into how we define performance there, is really shaped by this institutional framework. And it's a messy thing. It's overlapping, it's interacting, it's deeply interwoven. It's very hard to separate out a value or a dimension and say, but it's this thing that is holding back a certain group. It's very hard because people are not always even aware of how these institutions shape them. So we want to just highlight one point now, bringing new institutional economics back to markets, because there's actually quite a lot in new institutional literature that's being said about markets and market systems, with one of the first things being that markets themselves are social institutions. They are deeply embedded into the social fabric, the trust structures and all of these other institutions that we have in societies. And it's funny, I'm going to refer to Danny Roderick's work there, where he posed as an institutional economist for a moment, and the work of John Macmillan, who did a brilliant piece of work on looking at he called it preconditions, and then he renamed it, saying these functions, 5 functions that are essential for markets to emerge and to stay there. Because he said, look, markets emerge in the space station, in the ISS. A market has emerged, and in concentration camps or in humanitarian camps, markets emerge. Why then are we struggling with this in certain developing contexts? And he said there are 5 preconditions. The one is around property rights that are protected but not overprotected, so there needs to be some give and take there. That you must be able to curtail side effects, the ones you don't want. You must find ways of balancing the priorities of different stakeholders and the rights in an economy. People can be trusted, which involves mechanisms of enforcing trust, like contracts, laws, and so on. And that competition in the market is fostered, that there's efforts to increase the competition. This is essential. If you do all the other things and you don't do that one, then over time your market will become a monopoly and it will not be healthy. Roderick agreed quite a bit with these, but he added some other ones. For instance, he brought in institutions for conflict management, so this is when the laws doesn't work. Brought in some institutions on macroeconomic stability, saying these markets thrive and replicate and get copied within contexts where there's a certain amount of stability and predictability. And then what he brought in is institutions for social insurance. This is, what do we do with those that try things that fail? saying this is critical in market economies, that people that start new ventures or that try new kinds of things and they don't succeed, they have a fallback. And in many developing countries, the social insurance for people trying, the social fallback for people trying new things, it's very, for instance, in South Africa, I don't know where the business people go that fail, but they're not in South Africa anymore. We don't know where they are. Do exit interviews in South Africa is very hard because we don't have a system of dealing with people that don't succeed. You can never buy a house again, never have a check account, never have a credit card again in South Africa. Go somewhere else, Australia or Canada or something. Okay, so
can I just say something about this slide? The reason why we put it here, this looks not very specific in the context of the discussions we've had, but what we want to show here is really the importance of institutions. Like, even if we just think about markets, and I mean, we're now thinking about things beyond markets, but even looking at this list, how many institutions that are required for markets to work smoothly over time is staggering. And still, in reality, we see a lot of projects stuck in trying to reorganize micro-level transactions and to figure out how these can be optimized, and not even having the space to think about these things and to try to figure out how these can be tackled.
So a clue that something in that list is not in place is when the transactions in a market system are all relatively simple and they require almost face-to-face transactions. Because whenever something in that list is not working or is completely absent, it's very, very hard for people to move towards more sophisticated forms of transactions that involve impersonal exchange, where I don't even know who you are, where you come from. I'm shipping the goods to you and I trust that you will pay me, and you trust me that the thing that arrives at your door will do what I promised you it will do. So if something is lacking in this table, severely lacking of course, or maybe even interacting, then you would typically find simple markets depending on spot transactions where people know each other, selling simple goods where it's very easy to assess the quality of.
So now we know about the importance of institutions, but the question is, well, how do they change? Can we play a role in them changing, and what could be that role? We, when I say we, I mean development actors, or who should take the agency in changing these institutions? And just to quickly link back to evolutionary economics, when you remember the three spaces of evolution: physical technologies, social technologies, and business plans. Institutions are social technologies, essentially. It's not the whole sphere of social technologies, but a very important part of them. So just to link the two bodies of knowledge together, so we have a kind of a relation there. But how do they change? Institutions are strongly based on predominant beliefs in a society. So do we believe that women are equal to men, or do we not believe that as a society will determine or will strongly shape how we set up our institutional frameworks on gender relations and so on. These institutional frameworks, as we heard before, they are defining economic performance. But we also continuously reevaluate economic performance and say, well, is it working out for us? And one thing, and say, well, does the institutional framework lead to the type of economic performance that we expect? And then we feed this perception of whether it works or whether it doesn't work back into our belief system. One thing that we have seen in the Western world is that, well, we figured out that believing that women are not equal to men doesn't really allow us, and this is a very narrow statement, obviously, but the economic performance is not as good as it could be. It would work better if we see women as equal to men. So we updated that belief system. We're still not there completely, but we see that there is a possibility that beliefs are changed, and then the institutional framework around those beliefs are updated as well. So it's a continuous cycle of perception of what works, what doesn't work, and updating the belief system and institutional framework. This is not something that we do intentional very often. This is often done unintentional. at least partly. Partly it's also done intentionally very often. But there are certain aspects here that limit our ability to change and to update these institutional frameworks. And one of them is in ideology, because it often narrows down what we perceive and how we react to what we perceive. But also that our institutional framework is strongly embedded in a distinct societal context. So if you're in the UK, then the institutional framework is strongly embedded in the British society and the history of the British society and how it came to where it is now, which doesn't allow it to change in all directions. It gives it a certain path dependency. So there are certain aspects that limit the ability of us as humans to update our belief systems and of the institutional framework to change. Now, obviously, if there is any institutional economist here who will smack me because it's overly simplified, but it gives a kind of an impression around where new institutional economics thinking is going about how important institutions are and how institutions evolve and how they change over time. Because they do change, they're not static. And an important insight of these types of dynamics about path dependence, about boundaries to update our belief systems, we can actually draw from complexity sciences, and sciences around complexity and social change, which is the third body of knowledge that we looked at in our literature study. Because we chose this one, which seems a bit odd because it doesn't explicitly have anything to do with economics, but we added it onto the mix because for us it was very clear that it's a very powerful way of describing these dynamics. Evolutionary systems are fundamentally complex systems, so complexity science and the sciences around complexity science, because it's not one distinct science, can help us to understand these dynamics better, but can also help development actors to get cues on where to change, where to intervene, and maybe even face some of the dilemmas that Duncan mentioned before. If we understand these dynamics, maybe this will help us to solve some of these dilemmas and know whether we should maybe behave rather like this or rather like that.
It also adds a whole bunch of extra things onto that list.
Yes, also. Now the core about complexity is something that's called emergence. And again, emergence is on the one hand a colloquial word we use very often in our daily lives, but it's also a very specific effect of individual actors within a system interacting and making up their own way of doing things while they go along. I often use a simple community, a village or a town as an example where you see people interacting on a daily basis, family groups, wider families, strangers interacting, meeting each other. Out of continuously interacting, there is a so-called emergent structure is created, which defines how you would interact, would be seen as friendly, would be seen as offensive, how you would, when you meet a stranger, how you would behave. Those are all the kind of structures that over time emerge by just us being there and interacting with each other. Conventions that are formed through that. But as the examples already show, these structures don't only, but they usually allow us to do things that we wouldn't be able to. Within a community where we are able to achieve things that an individual wouldn't be able to achieve. Like specialization of knowledge, where you are able to, someone is a butcher, someone is a carpenter, whatever, wouldn't be possible if you were on your own. But at the same time, these structures that enable us to do things also constrain us. So I cannot do everything I want in my village because it wouldn't be accepted by the community, by the structures that emerged. So this dynamic of continuously forming the structures according to which we live is what makes complex systems complex. Because it's not something that settles down into an equilibrium. Now we have our structure, we have all our rules, and from now on we'll just live after those rules. No, we always continuously, linking back again to my little new institutional economic feedback loop, we always reevaluate, does this actually do the job? Or do we have to rethink our structures and rethink the way we interact with each other? So this is what makes up complexity. It makes up complex systems. And as soon as people interact with each other, systems become complex because these dynamics start to happen. Now there's a distinction to be made here, which I think is important, between complicated and complex. Because often these two things are used interchangeably. Now complicated are the things that are stable and predictable, where the things actually do settle into equilibriums, where I know, well, if it's this way today, it will be this way tomorrow. If I put my coffee pad into the machine and press the button today, I'll get the same coffee that I will get tomorrow. The sum of the functionality of the parts of my coffee machine make up my whole coffee machine. They don't do more and they don't do less.
Well,
well, but if one piece doesn't work anymore, the coffee machine won't work. I think that's the important thing. What change approach do we adopt here? It's a fairly conventional change approach. It's results oriented. We know we can determine milestones. We can determine deliverables. We can define it well. We can define a monitoring system that helps us decide, well, have I achieved it or not? I can be paid if I achieved it. I cannot be paid if I didn't achieve it. It's all fairly straightforward. Examples could be, for example, setting up an invoicing system in a company, building a bridge, constructing a new road. Fairly, I mean, that might be complicated. I couldn't build a bridge. I mean, you need an engineer and you need not statistician, but the one who looks that it doesn't.
All of that.
Whatever, yeah. Smart people. So it's not to kind of say it's a simple problem, but it's manageable with these tools I mentioned. Now complex, where you have this emergent causality that makes itself up while it goes. You have situations where the whole is more than the sum of the parts. I mentioned before that communities can achieve things individual community members cannot achieve. If one individual community member falls sick, the community still functions as a community. It's not like the coffee machine that stops working. Because all the other parts adapt to this part missing and kind of compensate. The change approach is very different. You cannot just go and plan because the parts of the system adapt to your plan and might make it achieve something very different that you wanted to achieve. So you need a monitoring system that continuously observes what is happening and allows you to adapt what you do as a consequence.
The example that Duncan gave about having the HR problem here would also be the inverse, where a really good person can make a really bad plan work, which is also one of the challenges. It's not only that the wrong person can make a good plan not work, it's also the opposite. We see sometimes that it's really a bad plan. But the person that's deployed is committed, they're resourceful, they can think on their feet, and they make a bad plan work. That's possibly an example.
Or to link back to my example before about building a bridge, it's one thing to build a bridge, but it's another thing to solve a congestion problem in a big city. You need different kind of skills, and you know that if you now introduce speed limits, if you introduce limits to what kind of car can drive, people will react to it. They might adopt strategies that you wouldn't expect them to adopt, and lead to problems that you didn't expect. It's a totally different things. You need different approach to the different skill set. And thanks, Mike, for this example. So there's a couple of things that we can take from complexity science that will help us describe these dynamics. And one of the things that we came across and we like very much is attractors. Now, an attractor is a thing that that describes a dominant behavior. It can be a convention in a community. Like I'm using the kind of clothes you put on. Women put on separate clothes, different clothes than men. This is a convention, it's an attractor. People adhere to it. If you don't adhere to it, you will be punished in a way that people will look at you weirdly, and you're just not part anymore, really, of that community. So the attractor, you fall into this attractor, and then it's kind of really difficult to behave in a different way than what is defined by the attractor. So it's embodying a set of coherent values or specific norms. But the important point here, it also modulates the way you process information. That if you get new information, it will always be filtered by the attractors that you are kind of pulled in or have fallen into. Another example of an attractor that might help you make sense of this is technological paradigms, where you say there was the technological paradigm of paper and print, where you have books and articles that are printed or journals, is an attractor, because when you're in this business of printing books and marketing books, you think in paper terms, you think in physical terms, and usually it's very hard to imagine for someone who's very deep into this what a different paradigm could look like e-books. And what could business plans for e-books look like? It's sometimes very difficult to imagine if you were part of a different paradigm. Now the illustration here you see two attractors, and the attractors are actually the black line, the landscape, if you want, are the attractors, and the colored balls in there are the systems. So the systems, or the people in the systems fall into these attractors. And if you want systemic change, then we need to change this landscape. We need to change the attractor landscape, or change. I mean, this is not something we can just go and pull a lever and then they change. I mean, this is the whole challenge. But is it systemic change if these things don't change, if you still have the same dominant attractor? Because the possibilities are great that the system will just fall back into whatever was before. You put a lot of energy in to push that yellow ball a bit up, and then you go away and it will just roll back. So maybe development often feels a bit like Sisyphus work. Another concept here is boundaries, and the analogy here is while you fall into attractors, you bounce off boundaries. Boundaries are not allowing you, not permitting you to do things. They can be written down rules like the rule of law. They can be even the laws of physics or boundaries that are determining how societies can work. They can be physical or social. Social boundaries often have taboos or social norms that forbid people to do things. Good. So this is the theory. Now, what do we do with it? Now, I don't know if anyone has any clarification questions just before we dive into the 7 principles that we have come up with based on thinking about this theory, based on interacting with a lot of practitioners as well. Or do you just want us to charge on? Good. So we've come up with 7 principles, and we kind of try to structure them a little bit. And the first 3 principles, as you will see, are describing in a way what we've described now with the theory. They're describing a way to look at economic systems. While then the second set of principles, principle 4 and 5, they look more about the role of development agents. And when I say development agents, I'm not saying necessarily international development agents. It can also be national development agents, like agents that are deployed by the central government to do economic development, to private sector development, investment promotion, and so on. And then the last 2 principles are more type of options. What are actually interventions like development agents, again, international and national can consider.
Okay, so the first one is about shifting our perspective from looking at allocation, the exact transactions and how cash flows, towards enabling evolution within systems. For me, this one was very important because in the past I worked quite a bit with value chains, so we really focus quite a lot on allocation and numbers and this. So well, actually, we have to understand how institutions, how alternatives, that variety thing, and how selection works, and understand that it's not about fixing one little line within a bigger system, but understanding how these systems themselves generate the variety and the alternatives. So here this is about refrain from designing expert solutions, external solutions, towards allowing people in the system to take risks, to try alternatives. So it's not just about parallel experiments, but also about making it safer for people to try alternate arrangements. The second one is around shifting from market failure, the way it's also often interpreted in the development circle, to market fitness. So this is not, I think Mike said it could almost sound neoliberal, but it's about really also understanding that markets themselves, they work even within organizations, and they allow a decentralized search for what is possible. So we should somehow, when markets do not perform the way we expect them to, or we can see this is clearly something isn't right here, to instead of seeing this as a problem, and saying, well, this could actually tell us something about the underlying processes, and maybe we should go and, with stakeholders, try and explore what is going on here, and try again alternative arrangements, try and reduce the risks to try alternative arrangements. The third one is, and this is also very hard often in developing countries, is to strengthen variety by embracing diversity. If you think about this, if you've ever tried to employ people in a development program, the challenge of managing a diverse team with experts that don't agree. This is hard in industrial countries, it's extremely hard in developing countries. But this diversity, this ability to engage with people that are different from you, that have a different worldview, that have different expertise or background, is something that is very hard. It's a social technology. And we must try in these countries to try and strengthen, again, the variety. This is often, it takes what Duncan said, takes it from a slightly different angle. It is about allowing dialogue. It is about getting people that would never go into the same room or go to the same place or really even intersect, to have dialogue and to discover together what is possible.
Number 4, principle number 4 is create and maintain situational awareness. And again, these two principles are more about development actors and how they act and what they do. And situational awareness really is about understanding these dynamics, these evolutionary dynamics, these complexity dynamics, creating a map that understands, well, there is these attractors, these are shaping behavior, we have these boundaries in place, and continuously update this map and allow this map to also, updating this map to also change strategies. And linking back to adaptive management again, it is not only about jumping in and just doing things, it's also about having this situational awareness, maybe starting with it by listening more what is going on, building up a certain awareness of what is going on before diving in and doing things. But then obviously while you do things, you need to keep this map updated and adapt strategy accordingly. This is true not only for, as I said, this is true not only for development agents, it's also true for organizations like extension agencies. They need to be aware what is going on, what are new technologies, what are the demand of farmers, what are changing trends in how farmers, what kind of crops farmers adopt, how the new TV channel is influencing farmer demands, and so on and so forth. So it's not only the development agents in a narrow sense who need to be aware of the situation. Then manage the complicated and explore the complex really links back into this differentiation between complicated and complex, where complicated you can manage, you can plan a project and set it up, you can define targets and milestones and just run with it. While complex must be explored, and learning and adjustment is a very central part of exploring complex problems and situations. So the last two are really about what we could do as development agents, and what we often start off with when we work with people that are stuck or in a system that is complex and maybe even messy.
The first one is around looking at the organizations. So this is now the shift there. This is organizations in this economic landscape that can enable or encourage self-discovery, risk-taking, that can play a role in trying out new things and comparing the results. So to try and find these organizations and not to bypass them if they appear dysfunctional or lost, but to work with them and through them. And to understand that these organizations often have limitations and constraints. And this then also implies more of a facilitation role, a risk reduction role to helping these organizations try alternative arrangements. I think the other thing here would be this, it's easy to talk about monitoring and evaluation, but learning and adaptation, of adapting your strategy if you get resistance, or adapting your strategy if something works, it's very hard to do. It's hard to do from a development project, but it's extremely hard to do often in developing countries. We made a joke just now where I said, for instance, in India, people follow the log frame more seriously than even, I think, than the original people had in mind when they came up with this thing. And so they've become more Roman than the Romans in terms of certain monitoring frameworks. It's very hard to get people in to say, okay, we've embarked on a path, we need to go back 3 steps and rethink. So it's very, very hard when you work in some contexts. The last principle is about, this sounds like a cliche, but again, this is something that development practitioners very often, we can do this. We can take the insights that we have at the local level, or at the grassroots level, and from inside certain organizations to policymakers. We can connect things, but not to do this in isolation of the local actors, the local organizations and institutions, but to equip them to do that. So this is, I get so frustrated when I have people learning from the grassroots, speaking at the top and not building the system along the way, asking why does this kind of information not flow? And then at the same time, sometimes taking policies from the top and explaining it on the grassroots. And there's a lot of work to be done going vertically between policymakers and people that are able to influence policy and how things actually get interpreted on the ground and backwards. And to say that in economies there are all kinds of organizations that in theory should play this role, but they often don't. They are dysfunctional for whatever reason. And that could be an entry point to look into, to say, well, instead of bypassing them, can we help them somehow?
Good. What does that mean for systemic change? Now, people who are in market systems development, they will recognize this. Currently, when we talk about systemic change, we often talk about scale, sustainability, and resilience. In practice, that this has, say, the dominant attractor at the moment in market systems development is this from pilot to scale logic, where you try to, well, you analyze the market. Obviously, you find root causes, and you say, well, this root cause is something that needs to be fixed, a market failure or a transaction or coordination problem, and then you find a solution, and generally you say, okay, like, this business plan would actually work much better in this context. So let's pilot this business plan with a couple of people. Seems to work, so let's scale it up. And then when it's at scale, we say, cool, we achieved systemic change. Which isn't wrong. I'm not saying that this logic is wrong. I think this logic works. There's a couple of aspects to it that are problematic if you think about the system as an evolutionary system. If you think about the need to equip local stakeholders to actually be able themselves to figure out what's wrong with the market and connect top down and bottom up. And, well, a lot of these principles, when we think about this definition of systemic change, we can find things that are at odds with the principle we've come up with. So we want to rephrase this. And the way we suggest to rephrase this is this one, where we talk much more about creating economic opportunities, creating variety, working with an institutional landscape that is adaptable and remains adaptable, and really buying and tapping into this evolutionary process as a source for continuous improvement and, in the end, structural change. Yes.
Excellent.
So now,
thank you. Look, what I want to do actually is I want to throw open for questions, but I also want to just flag up that what I'm going to do next is ask Andrew to talk about how New Tech in Uganda actually applied some of these ideas in practice, and which, in a way, I think will answer a lot of questions that people have, because I found it anyway a very practical, kind of tangible realization of these ideas. But I do still want to open it up in case people do have questions specifically for Shawn and Marcus before Andrew speaks.
So where does that take you on that dichotomy that Duncan had between getting stuck in a triangle versus, doesn't this just say it's about fixing the living environment, because that's really what you can?
well, for me, this is very similar to top-down versus bottom-up. I don't think it's the one or the other. I think it's about finding the balance between the two poles and say, well, we need to do the one without not doing the other. How can we find the things that work? And it's most probably different in different contexts. I'm not sure if that's actually an answer to that. It's just avoiding the question.
Well, I think it's balance. I think you're saying it's got to be both.
Yeah.
Like most dichotomies, it isn't. Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah, I think that the word balance is also maybe even controversial to say. It's always a little bit of both, and the mix will depend on the context and also how it is changing.
Yeah.
The question is always where to start.
Which probably, again, depends on where you're coming from. What is your background when you enter a scene? Because we as individuals in an organization are as path-dependent as the societies and economies that we talk about. So this will definitely influence what choices we make, where to start or where to give priority. I don't think there is an easy answer.
I mean, I'll get into it a bit in my presentation, but just a comment on that is this idea around moving a bit from microtransactions, more of the institutional framework. That's typically the home of governance programs within programming.
Yeah.
And we typically, it gets to a human resources question, we typically hire lots of business kind of folks or private sector-y kind of folks to design and implement these programs on the ground. We don't typically engage that kind of political economist type approach as much in these types of programs, and I think that's one of the things that came up to me, as well as how do these two things come together a bit better than they do right now, whereas, we don't deal with national institutions, that would be a governance program is doing that. We do business models and
Transactions.
Exactly.
I mean, and on that point, the government's lot are having a massive rethink about that they don't think they can just build institutions. So there's a danger when you say strengthen organisations that you think you know how to do that. And there's a whole rethink going on within the people whose job is to strengthen organisations. Say, actually, we don't know. We've spent 20 years failing to do that. We need to do this whole problem-led, iterative, adaptive approach with these local actors and see what emerges. So there's a slight risk that you need to put those two pieces together, I think, otherwise you'll kind of miss some of the benefits of bringing the ideas.
Well, the risk, maybe we should say later, there's a risk of getting into a discussion, but there's a neat synthesis, I think, that comes from when I think about, getting stuck in moving with processes versus changing the enabling environment. I mean, from international relations theory, which talks about rules of the game versus like a realist vision of politics, which is like billiard balls versus the structure of the billiard table. And the synthesis that comes between that is thinking about actually it's the processes itself that evolve the institutions, right? That slowly change the rules of the game. So if you play enough billiards, then the actual shape of the billiard table ends up moving in the environment. So which I think answers that question about how do you change the enabling environments through endogenous process, like supporting endogenous process that reshape that environment themselves, right? Rather than because we know that pure enabling environment stuff just never works. It's very bland. It just kind of like is very diluted, and we know that kind of you can be very isolated and very micro in processes. But actually, I think there is a neat synthesis now between the two.
Which gets us then into, but we're not going there.
So, and that's partly because I didn't have a chance to ask you how you wanted to be introduced, but maybe you can introduce yourself.
Yeah.